28 Metzora Leper, Metzora Leper, Parashah 28 Metzora person afflicted with TZARA, Torah Vayikra, Leviticus, 14:1-15:33, Haftarah Lactim Bet, 2 Kings, 7:3-20, Pirit Hadashah Mattityahu, Matthew, 9:20-26, Mark 5:20-34, Luke 8:40-48, Messianic Jews, Hebrews, 13:4, Torah Vayikra, Leviticus, 14:1-15:33, 14:1 Adonai said to Moshe, this is to be the law concerning the person afflicted with TZARA on the day of his purification. He is to be brought to the Kohen, and the Kohen is to go outside the camp and examine him there. If he sees that the TZARA sores have been healed in the afflicted person, then the Kohen will order that 2 living clean birds be taken for the one to be purified, along with cedar wood, scarlet yarn and hyssop leaves. The Kohen is to order one of the birds slaughtered in a clay pot over running water. As for the live bird, he is to take it with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn and hyssop and dip them and the living bird in the blood of the bird slaughtered over running water, and sprinkle the person to be purified from the TZARA 7 times. Next he is to set the live bird free in an open field. He who is to be purified must wash his clothes, shave off all his hair and bathe himself in water. Then he will be clean, and after that, he may enter the camp. But he must lie outside his tent for 7 days. On the 7th day he is to shave all the hair off his head, also his beard and eyebrows he must shave off all his hair. And he is to wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day he is to take 2 male lambs without defect, 1 female lamb in its first year without defect, and 6½ quarts of fine flour for a grain offering, mixed with olive oil, and 2/3 of a pint of olive oil. The Kohen purifying him is to place the person being purified with these items before Adonai at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The Kohen is to take one of the male lambs and offer it as a guilt offering with a 2/3 pint of olive oil, then wave them as a wave offering before Adonai. He is to slaughter the male lamb at the place in the sanctuary for slaughtering sin offerings and burnt offerings, because the guilt offering belongs to the Kohen, just like the sin offering. It is especially holy. The Kohen is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand and on the big toe of his right foot. Next, the Kohen is to take some of the 2/3 pint of olive oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand. Dip his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand and sprinkle from the oil with his finger 7 times before Adonai. Then the Kohen is to put some of the remaining oil in his hand on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, on the big toe of his right foot and on the blood of the guilt offering. Finally, the Kohen is to put the rest of the oil in his hand on the head of the person being purified, and the Kohen will make atonement for him before Adonai. The Kohen is to offer the sin offering and make atonement for the person being purified because of his uncleanness. Afterwards, he is to slaughter the burnt offering. The Kohen is to offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for him, and he will be clean. If he is poor, so that he can't afford to do otherwise, he is to take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved, to make atonement for him. 2 quarts of fine flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, 2/3 of a pint of olive oil, and 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, such as he can afford, the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day, he will bring them to the Kohen for his purification, to the entrance of the tent of meeting before Adonai. The Kohen is to take the lamb of the guilt offering and the 2/3 of a pint of olive oil and wave them as a wave offering before Adonai. He is to slaughter the lamb of the guilt offering, and the Kohen is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand and on the big toe of his right foot. The Kohen is to take some of the olive oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand, and sprinkle with his right hand some of the oil that is in his left hand 7 times before Adonai. The Kohen is to put some of the oil in his hand on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, on the big toe of his right foot in the same place as the blood of the guilt offering. Finally, the Kohen is to put the rest of the oil in his hand on the head of the person being purified, to make atonement for him before Adonai. He is to offer one of the doves or young pigeons, such as the person can afford. Whatever his means suffice, for the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering with the grain offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement before Adonai for the person being purified. Such is the law for the person who has TZARA sores if he cannot afford the usual elements used for his purification. Adonai said to Moshe and Aaron, when you have entered the land of Canaan which I am giving you as a possession, and I put an infection of TZARA in a house in the land that you possess, Then the owner of the house is to come and tell the Kohen, "It seems to me that there may be an infection in the house." The Kohen is to order the house emptied before he goes in to inspect the infection, so that everything in the house won't be made unclean. Afterwards, the Kohen is to enter and inspect the house. He will examine the infection, and if he sees that the infection is in the walls of the house, with greenish or reddish depressions that seem to go in deeper than the surface of the wall, he is to go out of the house to its door and seal up the house for 7 days. The Kohen will come again on the 7th day and examine the house. If he sees that the infection has spread over its walls, he is to order them to remove the infected stones and throw them into some unclean place outside the city. Next, he is to have the inside of the house thoroughly scraped, and the scraped-off plaster is to be discarded outside the city in an unclean place. Finally, other stones must be set in the place of the first stones and other plaster used to replaster the house. If the infection returns and breaks out in the house after the stones have been removed and the house scraped and plastered, then the Kohen is to enter and examine it. If he sees that the infection has spread in the house, it is a contagious tzeret in the house, it is unclean. He must break down the house and take its stones, timber and plaster out of the city to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever enters the house at any time while it is sealed up will be unclean until evening. Whoever lies down or eats in the house must wash his clothes. If the Kohen enters, examines and sees that the infection has not spread in the house since it was plastered, then he is to declare the house clean, because the infection is cured. To purify the house, he is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn and hyssop leaves. He is to slaughter one of the birds in a clay pot over running water. He is to take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn and the live bird and dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird and in the running water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He will purify the house with the blood of the bird, and the running water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop and the scarlet yarn. But he is to set the live bird free outside the city in an open field, thus will he make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. Such is the law for all kinds of tzeret sores, for a crusted area, for tzeret in a garment, for a house, for a swelling, for a scab and for a bright spot. To determine when it is clean and when it is unclean, this is the law concerning tzeret. 15:1 Adonai said to Moshe and Aaron, "Tell the people of Israel, when any man has a discharge from his body, the discharge is unclean. The discharge is unclean no matter whether it continues flowing or has stopped, it is still his uncleanness. Every bed which the person with a discharge lies on is unclean, and everything he sits on is unclean. Whoever touches his bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Whoever sits on anything the person with a discharge sat on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches the body of the person with a discharge is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with a discharge spits on someone who is clean, the latter is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Any saddle that the person with a discharge rides on will be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him will be unclean until evening. He who carries those things is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with a discharge fails to rinse his hands in water before touching someone, that person is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with a discharge touches a clay pot, it must be broken. If he touches a wooden utensil, it must be rinsed in water. When a person with a discharge has become free of it, he is to count 7 days for his purification. Then he is to wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water. After that, he will be clean. On the 8th day, he is to take for himself 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, come before Adonai to the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the Kohen. The Kohen is to offer them, the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for him on account of his discharge before Adonai. If a man has a seminal emission, he is to bathe his entire body in water. He will be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather on which there is any semen is to be washed with water. It will be unclean until evening. If a man goes to bed with a woman and has sexual relations, both are to bathe themselves in water. They will be unclean until evening. If a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she will be in her state of niddah for 7 days. Whoever touches her will be unclean until evening. Everything she lies on or sits on in her state of niddah will be unclean. Whoever touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Whoever touches anything she sits on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. As soon as he touches the bed or something she sat on, he will be unclean until evening. If a man goes to bed with her, and her menstrual flow touches him, he will be unclean 7 days. And every bed he lies on will be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days not during her period, or if her discharge lasts beyond the normal end of her period, then throughout the time she is having an unclean discharge she will be as when she is in niddah she is unclean. Every bed she lies on at any time while she is having her discharge will be for her like the bed she uses during her time of niddah. And everything she sits on will be unclean with uncleanness like that of her time of niddah. Whoever touches those things will be unclean. He is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If she has become free of her discharge, she is to count 7 days. After that, she will be clean. On the 8th day, she is to take for herself 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the Kohen at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The Kohen is to offer the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for her before Adonai on account of her unclean discharge. Mafti 31. In this way you will separate the people of Israel from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in a state of uncleanness for defiling my tabernacle which is there with them. Such is the law for the person who has a discharge, for the man who has a seminal emission that makes him unclean, for the woman in niddah during her menstrual period, for the person, man or woman, with a discharge, and for the man who has sexual relations with a woman who is unclean. Haftarah Lachim Bet, 2 Kings, 7:3-20. 7:3. Now there were 4 men with Tzeret at the entrance to the city gate, and they said to each other, why should we sit here till we die? If we say, we'll enter the city, then the city has been struck by the famine, so we'll die there, and if we sit still here, we'll also die, so let's go and surrender to the army of Aram. If they spare our lives, we will live, and if they kill us, we'll only die. They got up during the twilight to go to the camp of Aram. But when they reached the outskirts of the camp of Aram, they saw no one, for Adonai had caused the army of Aram to hear the sound of chariots and horses. It sounded like a huge army. And they said to each other, the king of Israel must have hired the kings of the Hittite and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us. So they jumped up and fled in the twilight, leaving their tents, horses, donkeys and the whole camp just as it was, and ran for their lives. When these men with Tzeret reached the outskirts of the camp, they entered one of the tents, ate and drank, then took some silver, gold and clothing, and went and did it. Next they returned and entered another tent, took stuff from there, and went and did it. But finally they said to each other, what we are doing is wrong. At a time of good news like this, we shouldn't keep it to ourselves. If we wait even till morning, we will earn only punishment, so come on, let's go and tell the king's household. So they came and shouted to the gatekeepers of the city and told them the news. We went to the camp of Aram, and no one was there, no human voice, just the horses and donkeys tied up, and the tents left in place. The gatekeepers called and told it to the king's household inside. Then the king got up in the night. He said to his servants, I'll tell you what Aram has done to us. They know that we're hungry, so they've gone outside the camp and hidden in the countryside, saying, when they come out of the city, we'll take them alive and then get inside the city. One of his servants answered, I suggest letting some men take 5 of the remaining horses that are left in the city. They are like everything else in Israel that remains. Like everything else in Israel, practically finished, and we'll send and see. So they took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent after the army of Aram, saying, go, and see. They went after them all the way to the Yarden, and found the entire distance strewn with clothing and other articles Aram had thrown away in their haste. The messengers returned and told the king. Then the people went out and ransacked the camp of Aram, with the result that 6 quarts of fine flour was sold for only a shekel and half a bushel of barley for a shekel. In keeping with what Adonai had said, the king put the servant on whose arm he had leaned in charge of the gate, and the people trampled him down in the gateway, so that he died, as the man of God had said he would, who spoke when the king came to him. For the man of God had said to the king, tomorrow by this time 6 quarts of barley will sell for only a shekel and half a bushel of fine flour for a shekel, in the market, at the gate of Shomron. The servant had answered the man of God, why, this couldn't happen even if Adonai made windows in heaven. And Elisha had said, all right, you yourself will see it with your own eyes, but you won't eat any of it. That is exactly what happened to him, because the people trampled him down in the gateway, so that he died. Pirit Hadashah Mattityahu, Matthew 9:20-26, Mark 5:20-34, Luke 8:40-48, Messianic Jews, Hebrews 13:4, Matthew 9:20. A woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years approached him from behind and touched the tzitzit on his robe. For she said to herself, if I can only touch his robe, I will be healed. Yeshua turned, saw her and said, courage, daughter, your trust has healed you, and she was instantly healed. When Yeshua arrived at the official's house and saw the flute players, and the crowd in an uproar, he said, everybody out, the girl isn't dead, she's only sleeping, and they jeered at him. But after the people had been put outside, he entered and took hold of the girl's hand, and she got up. News of this spread through all that region. Mark 5:24. He went with him, and a large crowd followed, pressing all around him. Among them was a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had suffered a great deal under many physicians. She had spent her life savings, yet instead of improving, she had grown worse. She had heard about Yeshua, so she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his robe. For she said, if I touch even his clothes, I will be healed. Instantly the hemorrhaging stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been healed from the disease. At the same time, Yeshua, aware that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? His Talmidim responded, you see the people pressing in on you, and still you ask, who touched me? But he kept looking around to see who had done it. The woman, frightened and trembling, because she knew what had happened to her, came and fell down in front of him and told him the whole truth. Daughter, he said to her, your trust has healed you. Go in peace, and be healed of your disease. Luke 8:42. For he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. As he went, with the crowds on every side virtually choking him, a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years, and could not be healed by anyone, came up behind him and touched the tzitzit on his robe. Instantly her hemorrhaging stopped. Yeshua asked, who touched me? When they all denied doing it, Kepha said, Rabbi, the crowds are hemming you in and jostling you. But Yeshua said, someone did touch me, because I felt power go out of me. Seeing she could not escape notice, the woman, quaking with fear, threw herself down before him and confessed in front of everyone why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. He said to her, my daughter, your trust has saved you, go in peace. Hebrews 13. For marriage is honorable in every respect, and, in particular, sex within marriage is pure. But God will indeed punish fornicators and adulterers,